Si me permiten su atención a todos los presentes, estamos esperando que algunas personas terminen de hacer su registro para poder empezar con esta inauguración. Muchas gracias. Ya. Buenos días. Antes de comenzar esta actividad, les solicitamos por favor silenciar sus teléfonos celulares. Muchas gracias. En nombre de la Universidad Austral de Chile y la comunidad latinoamericana de Objetos de Aprendizaje, LACLO, damos a todos ustedes la más cordial bienvenida a la ceremonia de inauguración de las Octavas Conferencias Latinoamericanas de Objetos y Tecnologías del Aprendizaje 2013. Saludamos cordialmente a las autoridades que nos acompañan. Doctor rector suplente de la Universidad Austral de Chile. Señor Luis, académico, Instituto de Informática de la Universidad Austral de Chile. Doctor James, director del Centro de Excelencia Acquire, integrantes de la comunidad latinoamericana de objetos de aprendizaje, académicos, directores de escuela e institutos de la Universidad Austral de Chile, invitados especiales, señoras y señores. Para darles la bienvenida a esta actividad, invitamos al profesor Luis Álvarez, académico del Instituto de Informática de la Facultad de Ciencias de la Ingeniería de la Universidad Austral de Chile.
Gracias. Señor rector subrogante, colegas, amigos, bienvenidos a la Universidad Austral de Chile, bienvenidos a Valdivia, bienvenidos a LACLO 2013. LACLO comunidad en el año 2006, cuando Javier Ochoa invita a las Conferencias Latinoamericanas de Objetos de Aprendizaje, a las que también llamó LACLO, de Latinoamerican Conference on Learning Objects. El nombre pegó y decidimos cambiar Conferencias, Community, y de esa manera mantener LACLO. Hoy hemos ampliado nuestro ámbito de investigación y por eso hemos dado el nombre a Objetos y Tecnologías de Aprendizaje. LACLO hoy en día es mucho más que una comunidad de académicos latinoamericanos. En estos 7 años nos hemos transformado en una comunidad de amigos que, haciendo uso de las tecnologías estamos todo el tiempo conectados y colaborando en diversos proyectos. Sin embargo, las tecnologías de información son suficientes y por esta razón, año a año, nos reunimos para sentir el afecto de los demás, conversar y compartir nuestras últimas investigaciones. Estas conferencias se han transformado más importante en América Latina. Son itinerantes año a año. Se organizan en un país diferente, partiendo en el centro del mundo, pegado al Pacífico, Guayaquil, Ecuador. Han visitado Brasil, acercándose al Atlántico en Sao Paulo, y por el norte han llegado hasta Aguascalientes, más de 500 kilómetros al norte del Distrito Federal, y por el sur, ahora de Valdivia, algo más de 800 kilómetros de Santiago de Chile. En sus 8 versiones, han recorrido América Latina de este a oeste y de norte a sur. Este año nos acompañan los principales líderes mundiales en el área. James Dalziel, referente obligado en diseño de aprendizaje y creador de LAMS, el sistema de gestión de actividades más utilizado en el mundo. Sabine Graf, referente mundial en tecnologías de aprendizaje, por su vasta productividad en investigación y participación en grupos de trabajo y editora de revistas del área. Y Florencio Trega, conocido en toda Latinoamérica por sus redes de colaboración. Florencio estará con nosotros el próximo viernes, aunque de manera virtual. Si además sumamos a todos los líderes latinoamericanos en el área, Valdivia por esta semana se convierte en el centro de gravedad de las tecnologías del aprendizaje en el mundo. Hoy estamos en el sur del mundo, en el sur de América. Estamos en Valdivia, que debe su nombre a don Pedro de Valdivia, conquistador español, que la fundara en 1552. Antes de ello era conocida como Emilevo, en honor a su hermoso río. Por casi 200 años perteneció al virreinato del Perú y hace alrededor de 150 años albergó la primera colonia de inmigrantes alemanes. Fue siempre destacada por vivir aquí progresistas intelectuales. Fue un valdiviano que hace 200 años creó el primer periódico de Chile, y en la década del 50, cuando las principales universidades del centro comenzaron a instalar sedes a lo largo del país, un grupo de valdivianos crea su propia universidad, la Universidad Austral de Chile. Hoy, aunque muy pequeña, con alrededor de 12.500 estudiantes, se sitúa entre las primeras 5 universidades del país. Amigas y amigos, bienvenidos a la Universidad Austral de Chile, bienvenidos a Valdivia, bienvenidos a LACLO 2013.
Agradecemos las palabras del profesor Luis Álvarez. La conferencia tiene como objetivo contribuir a la creación de espacios que favorezcan una mayor comunicación entre el campo educativo y el campo tecnológico, por lo que se hará énfasis en 2 aspectos principales: recuperar experiencias de investigación educativa que permitan una mejor comprensión del uso y del impacto de las tecnologías de la información y comunicación en la práctica educativa situada, y reconocer los problemas reales de la educación en la región, a fin de construir soluciones tecnológicas pertinentes y efectivas. Invitamos al doctor Juan Omar Cofré, rector subrogante de la Universidad Austral de Chile, a dirigir algunas palabras.
Dear ladies and gentlemen, authorities, colleagues, students, and visitors, let me first say a few words to welcome our distinguished visitors. It's for us and the university an honor and pleasure to receive you in this conference which will explore a topic of great interest regards to teaching in the present and the future. Traditional education changed greatly, especially today's form of learning, which go hand in hand with technology, acquiring new and effective methods of virtual learning. Thanks for being here and sharing with us your experience and knowledge. We hope you have an excellent stay in our country, and that is a Congress be a complete success. We want you to consider the Universidad Austral de Chile your home here in South America, and we look forward to seeing you again anytime. Quiero decirles a todos los amigos y colegas que vienen del mundo hispanoparlante, que para nosotros es de gran interés poder trabajar en este congreso sobre las materias que ustedes han elegido, porque indudablemente aquí está el futuro. Quizá también está el presente, aunque no en todas partes se toma conciencia clara de que el futuro ha comenzado hoy y que de alguna manera el futuro está presente en una educación que quiere ser una educación que se ponga al servicio de las naciones y de la mejor calidad de vida de los habitantes del mundo entero. Ese es un ejercicio y un esfuerzo que en gran medida le compete y le corresponde a la educación, y las universidades tienen una palabra importante y poderosa que decir, y si no la dicen, otros la dirán por nosotros, porque el mundo avanza y no permite que nadie se quede en el pasado. Yo felicito a los organizadores de este congreso, felicito a todos los que han venido y a todos los que han hecho un esfuerzo por estar aquí, por intercambiar ideas, por conocer y por dejar un legado que va a ser precisamente la discusión que va a quedar en las actas y que seguramente después se va a publicar. Y finalmente quiero decirles una cosa que seguramente desde mi perspectiva resulta muy importante como filósofo, como jurista, y que es la siguiente: nunca perder de vista en la universidad que hay medios y fines. Este es un medio. ¿Cómo mejoramos la educación para hacer llegar la educación a aquellos lugares donde no llega? Ese es el medio, pero ese no es el fin. El fin es siempre y debe ser el hombre mismo, la persona humana, y entregarle a esa persona humana mayores opciones y posibilidades para que pueda desarrollar sobre la faz de la tierra una vida agradable, una vida feliz, y hacer plenamente real aquello que en todas partes del mundo hoy día se predica. Esto es, que los seres humanos tienen derechos y que esos derechos se llaman fundamentales, precisamente porque no se pueden obviar ni se pueden ignorar. Gracias, y espero que efectivamente tengan el mayor éxito.
Agradecemos las palabras del rector subrogante, doctor Juan Marco. Para dar por inaugurada esta actividad, presentamos al señor James Dalziel, profesor de Tecnologías de Aprendizaje y director del Centro e-Learning de Excelencia Macquarie, de la Universidad Macquarie en Sydney, Australia. El doctor Dalziel es conocido internacionalmente por su investigación y desarrollo de innovaciones en e-learning y estándares técnicos, con un extenso registro de publicaciones arbitradas y presentaciones. El doctor Dalziel presenta la charla Learning Design and Learning Analytics.
Hola. That is about the end of my Spanish. I'm very sorry. I will need to speak in English today. I'm told that many of you speak English much better than I can speak Spanish, so I will try. If I start to speak too quickly, you can go like this to slow me down. I talk fast sometimes, so I will try and speak slowly. For today's presentation. For today, I would like to talk about the new field of learning design. This field has only been around for about 10 years, and it is my main area of work. And so I will spend most of my talk talking about learning design and giving some examples. But then towards the end of the talk, I will also talk a bit about learning analytics and how I think these two areas can work together. Before I start, I would like to thank very much my good friend and colleague, Luis, for the invitation to come here. I am very happy to be here. This is my first time in South America and my first time in Chile, and I'm very pleased. It's a beautiful country, so I'm delighted to be here. Australia and South America, I think, are good friends because we are on the opposite sides of the Pacific Ocean. And so for me, I just come straight over to Chile. It was about 24 hours for me to come from Sydney, where I live, here to Valdivia. But I hear for many of you here in South America, it is also a long time to get from your home to here. So maybe we are all a bit tired from long flights. As I said, I will start by talking a bit about what is learning design and the background. I will then talk about some new work from just the last year on a document called the LACLO Declaration on Learning Design. It is from a group of experts on learning design who have written a sort of a new summary, a new synthesis of the ideas of learning design, and it was created when we were in the city of Larnaca in Cyprus, in Europe, which is why it has this name. I will then talk a bit about my work on the software LAMS, the Learning Activity Management System. This is a learning design system that I have been working on now for about 10 years. So I use it as an example. And then finally, I will compare or connect the area of learning design and learning analytics. Before I start talking about the theory and technical issues of learning design, maybe I will start with an example just to illustrate. This is an example of a learning design in the LAMS software that I use, and I'll talk more about LAMS later, but just a little bit about this learning design. This is a learning design that uses a teaching approach called Predict, Observe, Explain. It is a teaching approach that can be very useful in sciences and in other areas where you would like your students to, before they see an experiment or before they see a demonstration, to predict what they think is going to happen. What do they think is about to happen in this experiment? After the prediction, they then observe what happens when you run the experiment, or maybe show them an experiment on a video. And then after they have observed it, they need to try and explain what happened in the experiment, what they observed, and any differences between their prediction at the start and what they saw. And the idea of this teaching technique is that for some subjects, students have ideas already about what happens that are often wrong. And if you just tell them that they're wrong, it doesn't help them to learn as deeply as if they explain their ideas, then they see the experiment, and then they try and compare what they said with what they saw. So that is the idea of Predict, Observe, Explain as a teaching method. It can be used in many different topics, in many different courses, and it can be done as a face-to-face teaching method. If I was running an experiment, I have some experiment here, I could do it on the table. But in this case, we have it set up in an online environment. And I'll just show you the way that this learning design works. So this is all of the learning design. This part is the prediction part, then the observation, then the explanation. And so when the students come into this sequence, they are introduced to the topic, And this particular topic is about when the American astronauts went to the moon. An astronaut held a hammer in one hand and a feather in the other hand, and he dropped the two together to see what would happen. And so this was to help students to think about gravity and how gravity works. And they had to predict, would the two things drop at the same time to the ground, or would one drop faster than the other? This is the prediction that they needed to make. So the students see a video in this step of the astronaut on the moon just before they drop, and they are then asked to predict what they think is going to happen, and their predictions, they type into the computer what they predict. And then their answers are shared with all the other students in the group. If there is a class of students doing this together, they will see each other's answers, so they can see different ideas from within the class. After their prediction, they're also asked, how sure are you that you are right? How confident are you that your prediction is correct? Are you very confident, maybe a bit confident, or not confident? And they also have to give a reason for their prediction. Why do they think that this will happen the way it is? So this is all part of the prediction phase. Then after that they go to the observation, and here they see the video of the actual hammer and feather dropping together, and they are asked to describe what they saw, what happened in the video. And in this final step, the explanation phase, this is a discussion forum, and so students can go into the discussion forum and post what actually happened and how it might be different to what they predicted. And then they can talk with each other to try and understand why their prediction might be wrong. And their teacher can post comments to them to help them understand the way that gravity works. So this is one example, just one of a learning design. What I think is interesting about this learning design is that it is based on a group of learners, a class of learners, not just one student on their own. It has a role for the teacher to comment on the students' ideas in this discussion forum, which is at this step. So this is not an example of e-learning where there is no teacher. The teacher is part of this example. And perhaps one of the things that makes this different from other online systems like Moodle or other learning management systems is that it is a sequence. It is a series of steps. And the students must do it in those steps. If they jump ahead to the end, then they will learn nothing. They need to do it in that sequence. So we sometimes call a learning design like this a sequence, because it is a sequence of steps, a series of steps. The other idea about learning design as a field is that this sequence can be shared. So if I, as a teacher, if I build this sequence, I can give it to you. And you could use it in your teaching, or you could change it to suit your students. So in the same way that for learning objects, we have had the idea that we could create learning objects and share them with each other, and we could reuse learning objects. Here we can now also create sequences and share sequences with each other. And perhaps the difference between this and a normal learning object is that this has collaboration in it. Students work in groups, in teams, not just on their own. So that's a little bit of how a learning design might look. Let me just show you. This is a quick this is what the student would see. So when the student is doing this activity, these are the steps in the sequence running down here. Here is the main task. So there's the picture of the astronaut with the hammer and the feather. And in the main version of this, there is a video for students to watch. And when students have done this stage, they click here, next activity, and that will take them to the next task. And then, And just briefly, I will come back to this later, but this is the authoring area of LAMS, where a teacher creates a learning design. And so the teacher is able to take these tools, these activities, discussion forum, mind map, multiple choice quiz, questions, and drag them out into this area and build the sequence. I'll show you that a bit later with a bit more detail. But that is just very quickly sort of the essence of the new field of learning design. My apologies for those who already know the field. This may be quite familiar, but for those who are new to it, I thought I'd just start by explaining what a learning design is, what it is that a learning design system does that is a bit different to other approaches. So, by way of background, I think the field of learning design arose because there were some gaps, there were some problems with the general approach to e-learning that we had about 10 or so years ago. And I think there were problems in two areas, in the area of learning management systems and problems in the area of learning objects. I think for learning management systems, it was hard to create a sequence of activities for students. If you want students to work through a set of tasks, that was not easy to do in Moodle or Blackboard or other systems. You could have a course page, you could have some resources on the course page, but it was hard to have a sequence of steps like the learning design I just showed you. The biggest problem, I think, is probably this one, that when you create a good part of a course, and you create a good idea to help your students learn, there wasn't a way to take that out of the LMS and give that to a friend, to a colleague. So if I build some good teaching in my course, it's hard for me to take that out and give it to someone else. So that was one of the weaknesses in the area of learning management systems that led to this field of learning design. And even today, 10 years later, this area is still weak in learning management systems. It is still not very easy to take out a good teaching idea and share it with someone else. The other area is learning objects and work such as the learning object metadata, content packages from IMS, SCORM, courseware, this area. And the problem there was, this field, learning objects, was good at sharing. We can share learning objects with each other. And it was good at sequencing if the sequence was one student going through the sequence. But what it wasn't good at was collaborative learning. If a group of students want to learn together, like a class, to go through a sequence, that bit has been missing from most work in learning objects. And because of that, that led to some work in the IMS standards organisation on IMS learning design, a technical standard for learning design. And that and other work led to the wider field of learning design where I work. So that, I think, is some of the technical background that led to this new field of learning design. But I also think there is some educational theory that is important that led to learning design. I'd like to just try and briefly explain that. For some of you who are more technical, this may be not so familiar, but let me mention it nonetheless. Learning design as an educational theory is different from other educational theories. We have theories like constructivism as an educational theory, a way that students learn. And constructivism, as an educational theory, says students learn best by students leading the learning process and students constructing knowledge and understanding. And the teacher is only there to assist students in their learning. And so as a theory, constructivism says this is how a teacher should teach, because this is how a student can best learn. That's an example of an educational theory. There are others we could talk about. We could talk about traditional lecturing or instructivism. We could talk about connectivism. There are many of them. But learning design is different because learning design does not have an educational theory that says you should teach in a certain way. Learning design is sort of like one step backwards. It is an attempt to describe many different educational theories. It is trying to work out a sort of descriptive language, some new type of notation for describing what happens with students and teachers in classrooms or online. And this has sometimes been called a pedagogical meta-model, the idea of a descriptive model that is above or behind many different pedagogical theories. I sometimes think learning design is more like the arrangement of students and teachers over time. Who is doing what at what time? That is what learning design tries to describe. I'll give an example in a moment I'll go to this one. So, just to try and explain this idea from a different area, in the history of music, there were some people many, many years ago who said, we will never be able to write down music. It will be impossible to write down music. Music is too special. It is too in the mind. You cannot write it down. But over time, people started to try to write down music. And at least in the Western music tradition, this one example is from maybe 700 years ago, and it was an early attempt to write down music. The problem is, the way the music was written down was missing certain information to help tell a person how to recreate that musical experience. I have a musical background. I play the piano. And so when I look at this example, I have no idea. I cannot play this for you. I do not know what it means. But this example from about 400 years ago, this is from Bach, even though it's a bit messy, this example, the way to write down music had been agreed by that time, and in a way that had enough information to convey a musical idea from one person to another. So I, as a musician, can look at this example and I know what this means. And if I had enough time, I could play this piece of music. So something happened in the history of music from a period where people said there is no way to describe music, to write it down, to a period where people tried to describe it, but there was not enough information, to a time when then there was enough information to write down music, that me, hundreds of years later, in a very different world, can look at that and now I understand what that music meant. So I think, by analogy, learning design is trying to do the same thing for teaching and learning as music notation has done for music. We're trying to learn how could we write down what we do in teaching and in our classrooms, so that if I wrote it down and gave it to another teacher, they could understand what I did, and then they could choose to do the same, or more likely, they could change it a bit, but still learn from the idea. Now, I hasten to say, learning design is not up to this stage. This is where learning design is now. It's still only a small part of the problem. Teaching is very complex. We have a lot to learn about how to write it down. But learning design is trying to learn how to write it down. Okay? So that's a little bit of background then about what is learning design, and for me, why I think it is important. It is important for technology and for e-learning software, and I will show you LAMS in a moment. But I think it has greater significance even beyond technology. It is an idea that applies to all of education, or at least potentially all of education, because this is about describing good ways of teaching and sharing them with other teachers. That's the essence. That is the key idea. So now I'd like to talk a little bit about the Larnaca Declaration on Learning Design. This website, larnacadeclaration.org, the document about this is there, so you can go and read it. It's quite long, it's about 35 pages, but it is, I think, probably the best recent summary of what is learning design and where might learning design go in the future. So it is like a longer version of the part of the talk I just finished. In learning design, we have decided to talk about, at the core idea is what we call framework or notation. So like music notation, this is education notation, if you like. And there are three parts, we think, to that idea. The most central one is representation. How do we write it down? How do we describe it? What diagrams, what pictures could we use? What technical descriptions? So this is the most central part. But with it also comes two other ideas, that the reason we want to write down education is to share with other teachers, so that we as all teachers can become better at teaching by learning about good ideas from each other. So sharing is another core part of learning design. And then we also talk about guidance or advice. This is information to go with a learning design to explain what the learning design is, why it is built the way it is, how you might use that learning design in your own teaching. So it's sort of like a wrapper of advice around the description. So these are the sort of three most central parts of learning design. But one of the problems is that education is a very big area and it is a very complex problem. I would say it's a very messy problem. There are many bits and we're not quite sure how they all go together. So the Larnaca Declaration, one of the parts of it is that it has now a bit of a larger description of education, so that you can see where learning design fits with other parts of education. And this is what we call the conceptual map of the Larnaca Declaration, which I will show you in a moment. But it is an idea about all the other things we do in teaching and our students do in learning, and how they wrap around the idea of learning design. And finally, there's a third area which we've called learning design practice. This is the process of designing for learning. How a teacher goes about deciding what they will do to teach, what learning objects they will choose, what they know about their students. So it's learning design as a practice, as a doing, a verb, whereas this is more the description. This is describe a learning design. It's more like a noun. So, in terms of the first part, the representation, the most central part, we have not yet agreed on what that representation might be. We are still learning and developing. In the technical area, there have been a number of languages that have been built for this. IMS Learning Design, or IMS LD, is probably the most well-known, but there have been a few others. Educational Modelling Language, EML, which came before IMS Learning Design. There's another project, Learning Design Language, or LDL, from France, and there's our work on LAMS and a few others. These are technical languages to describe teaching and learning. But today I also want to show you three examples that are more visual, more like pictures of learning design, to give you some examples of early work on description. So I'll show you 3 in a moment. Just one thing before I do, this sometimes is confusing for people, that the field of learning design means the whole field. But we also sometimes say a learning design when we mean just one example, just one learning design. So unfortunately, the phrase means both things. It means learning design, the whole field, and a learning design means just one example. So let me now show you 3 examples of a learning design. This is a learning design from the LAM software, the software I work on, and this learning design is a role-play learning design. This is an example of a teaching approach where the teacher wants students to imagine they are in a scenario, some situation, and to take on a role and then to debate and discuss with others from different roles. This particular example is for trainee teachers, for students who are going to become teachers in schools. And the role play is they are to imagine that they are going to a new school, and that school is thinking about adopting interactive whiteboards, the whiteboards where you can press on them. And in that school, there are 4 groups. There are teachers who really like interactive whiteboards. There are teachers who don't think they're such a good idea. There is the management of the school principal, the school leaders, and there are the students in the school. So the people doing the learning design, they get an overview up the top here of the school and the scenario, and they are told about the 4 different roles. Then they are put into one of those 4 roles. So the system will randomly allocate them to one role. Teachers in favour, teachers with concerns, school leaders, or students. At this point, they then go off onto branches where they go just with the other students from their same role group. So all the teachers who are in favour go off to talk about their ideas about why the interactive whiteboards are good. The teachers who are against go off together to talk about their concerns. The school leaders go off together to talk about what they should do to lead the school with this disagreement. And the students go off together to talk about what they think about interactive whiteboards. So they do this process, and with an online discussion forum and other resources, and do that for maybe 1 week. Online they have some discussion. After that week, this stop is open, and all the students come here to a discussion forum for every student, and they then argue with each other to present their case and debate with the other students from other roles. They do that for maybe 1 or 2 weeks, and then this stop point is released, and then at the end of the sequence, they step back from their role and they reflect on what have they learned about this idea of interactive whiteboards. What did they learn by pretending to be their role, a teacher or a leader or a student? What would they do themselves if one day in the future they had this as a real situation? So this is an example of another learning design based on the teaching idea of a role play. But what I want you to notice here is that it has a visual way of conveying that idea. The step and sequences, this is one example of representation, of notation for a learning design. But unlike, say, IMS learning design, which is a technical notation, this is a sort of visual notation, picture notation. So that is one example, and one that I've worked on a lot. Let me show you 2 others briefly. Don't worry about all the words on this. I will give Lewis my slides after today so we can share with everyone if you want to look in more detail. But this is from a different project on learning design, also, as it happens, from Australia. And do you remember at the beginning I talked about predict, observe, explain as an example? This is actually another predict, observe, explain, but it has been written down in a different way. And in this case, the tasks that students have got to do run down the middle here. These are the tasks. Any resources that the students need, online tools, documents, they are down here. And on this side is what's called support. So this might be the support a teacher gives for giving advice or some other kind of support to help the students learn. So in this visual approach, this part here is the setup, the background to the predict, observe, explain. That one is students break up into pairs to work on the task. Then they make their prediction, they observe what's going to happen, they then try and explain to each other what they've learned, and then here the teacher gives a summary at the end of the class. And these are the different information and support that's given to students to help them as they do this task. So the reason I want to show you is that this is another type of description. It's a bit different to LAMS, but it's also a bit similar. It has the sequence of tasks, this time running down, but it has more information than LAMS. It has information about support and advice that is brought into the sequence. Okay, the third one I want to just briefly mention is what's called a pattern. Patterns are another kind of learning design that are more text-based, and they have a description of a particular problem that needs to be solved up the top, how to support collaborative learning, how do you help students to argue and debate with each other, and then some suggestions about how to solve that problem. And this particular example, which uses a teaching strategy called Jigsaw. Jigsaw is where you have, say, students at 4 tables, with 4 students at each table. They start by discussing a problem. Then one student from each table goes off to join with a student from each of the others to then talk in detail about one part of the problem. And so, having started off this little diagram here, they all go off to talk with each other, and then they come back to their original table and they share what they talked about at each different table. So one person has been to each different table for different discussion. They come back and then they share with their group what they learned from each discussion. It's just another good teaching idea for where discussion is important. And so I show this one as an example to show where written text is still an important part of the learning design, but also a diagram is part of that as well. So just to summarise then this idea of the core of learning design, there is representation, the diagrams or technical description, but there is also sharing, the idea we share with each other, a good approach, and there is also guidance. What advice does the teacher need to understand and to use this good teaching idea? That's the core of learning design, I think. So the next step I want to mention is in the Larnaca Declaration, we tried to talk about the wider world of education around learning design and all the other factors that may be relevant to how a teacher thinks about learning design. And we tried to use the same idea of the meta model for pedagogy, that is describing many different pedagogies, to try and describe the many different things that affect education. They're always different in one place to another, but all of those things. Now, it's a very hard task. I'm sure we have not described everything, but let me show you the diagram that we came up with to try and convey all the other things that might affect how a teacher does learning design. This bit here, this is the core part of learning design we've already discussed. So there's representation, sharing, and guidance. But what's done here is affected by what we call the teaching cycle. How it is that a teacher designs
and plans learning, how they engage with their students in the classroom or online, how they then reflect on what they learned from their interaction with students, and also how their professional developments, their learning about being a teacher over many years, how all those things run in a sort of cycle, and that process affects how a teacher makes decisions down here. But that teaching cycle itself is affected by many other things as well. It's affected by the level at which you are designing. Are you designing just one small task, a 5-minute task, or maybe just one class? Are you designing a whole session of activities? That might be a class or a week of activities. Are you designing a whole course? 12 weeks, 13 weeks of a whole course. Is it a whole degree or a whole program for 3 years or 4 years? We make different decisions depending on what level we are working at. So very small decisions down here will affect this leading to here. Very big decisions will have a different effect here and may lead to an impact there. On the other side, we also acknowledge that there is the educational philosophy of teachers and the discipline that they work in, and that has an impact on how we design. There is the theories and methods in their fields and the way that we do research about education and what we've learned. And there is the characteristics of students. What kind of students do you have? Are they very bright or are they struggling? What kind of institution are you working in and what restrictions or opportunities does your institution provide, and so on. So all of those also affect how we design and plan, and therefore what sort of choices we make here at Learning Design. Flowing out of that, we have the software tools and other resources that help us to do learning design, like LAMS and others. And we also have the way our students, our learners, respond to what we do. And there are different types of responses. There are quizzes and assessment tasks. There are surveys or evaluation, where a student says what they liked about a course, what they didn't like about a course. There is also feedback, how a student responds in the classroom, how the teacher is watching their students. Are they falling asleep? Do you need to wake them up? So that real-time interaction. And then finally, as I'll briefly mention at the end, there's the area of learning analytics. As we start to get much richer data about students, how could all these aspects of student behaviour feed back up into how we make decisions about learning design? I want to just give you 2 examples of how we've used this map to help us think a bit more about differences between different areas. One, perhaps many of you will be already familiar with, is sort of a SCORM example of learning objects or of courses, the traditional instructional design approach. And the other one I'll mention is from Diana Laurelard's what's called the conversational framework. I don't have time today to explain all about the conversational framework, but it is a way that teachers and students interact and how they reflect on their learning process. So to just give you an example, this is an attempt to look at, from a SCORM example or from instructional design, what are the most important parts when you're doing that kind of work. So it's mostly about design and planning. How you build your learning objects is all done before it's run with students. There's not so much about the teacher engaging with students because the student just does it on the computer. There's a strong emphasis on the student. There's a strong emphasis on small activities and how we learn. Strong emphasis on the tools and particularly on assessment, looking at quiz scores and other information as to how students learn. So those areas of the bigger map which are particularly important in instructional design or in SCORM areas. By contrast, if we looked at Diana Laurelard's conversational framework, most of that is more about how teachers engage with students and how teachers reflect on their learning and how students reflect on their learning. It's about both teacher and learner. It's about guidance on how to teach. It's about tools, but it's particularly about feedback. It's about the interaction between teacher and learner in the classroom or online in real-time interaction. It's not so much about quiz scores. And so I think if we overlay both of these together, we can see that there are some areas that are common between these two different approaches, but some areas where they are different. And so perhaps if you're wondering, well, how come this learning design seems quite different to my work on learning objects? This is our attempt to try and explain how some of those differences come about. This is the big map of all the things going on in education, or not all, but a lot of things in education, and different parts of e-learning have focused on some areas more than others. The final part about the Larnaca Declaration I want to mention is the third section, what we've called practice. And the reason this is important is this is the reason that we all care about teaching and learning. We want to be able to teach effectively. We want to teach well. We want to help our students to learn well. That's what we really care about. We don't care about writing down education to just find out, can we write down education? We want to write down education so we can share good ideas from one teacher to another. That's why we care. And so this third area is about practice. So it's how do teachers design, and how do they design to encourage effective learning? What decisions will help our students to learn better? And I think here the example of music is quite useful, because we don't write down music just for the challenge of, can you write down music? We write it down to convey beautiful music and share beautiful music with each other. But there are many types of beautiful music. There are different styles of music. There is classical music, there is modern music. Well, I think perhaps in education we could say the same thing. There are many different ways of teaching, and many of them can be effective. So we want different types of teaching methods, but we want one way to describe all the different methods. The same music notation system can describe many examples of different styles of music. If we had one education notation system, it could describe many different ways of teaching effectively. So we've called this learning design practice, and one of the reasons we like this is that even for people who've never heard of learning design before, they've never come across the field, even the phrase learning design sounds like what teachers do. They design their learning. They carefully decide, how will I help my students to learn in the way that will help them learn effectively, to learn well. I should say, though, that effective here doesn't mean just one approach. It doesn't mean just collaborative learning. It doesn't mean just constructivism. I think that drill and practice, and things can be, very useful in certain contexts for certain subjects. So we're trying to be quite broad about what we mean here, that there are many types of learning that may be effective. What matters is how do your students learn your subject in your institution, and what methods are effective to help that. And that may be many different methods. So to summarise then, the Larnaca Declaration says that learning design as a field, the whole field, is actually three major areas. It is, at the heart of it, the learning design framework, like IMS learning design, like LAMS, and other examples of representation and guidance and sharing. But it is also this wider conceptual map of all the other issues that affect how teachers teach. And it is practice, how teachers every day go about doing teaching. So just very briefly, I'll mention LAMS. For those of you interested to know more about LAMS, you could come and talk to me in the session after morning tea to learn a bit more about it. But this is my own work. It's probably the world's leading system for learning design. It's used by some thousands of teachers or educators in about 80 or so countries, and it is translated into 33 languages, including Spanish and some others. And LAMS is freely available as open source software. Any of you can get it and use it and adapt it. And LAMS can be used on its own, or it can be integrated with Moodle or other learning management systems. There are users of LAMs in both schools. We know in Europe some LAMs called lessons can have up to 3 a good place to go.